Now we're going to talk a little bit about race relations on the home front before and during World War I, which brings us back to this individual that we've come across several times already, W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1905, Du Bois and several other leaders of the African American community met on the Canadian side of Niagara in 1905 to try to discuss possible ways to organize more effectively and to agitate for civil rights. 3 years after that, there was a huge race riot in Springfield, Illinois. And again, I remind you, pre-1960s race riots always involved large numbers of white people going on rampages and attacking minorities, usually African Americans, though not always. So this was a huge race riot, and in response to that riot, many of the people who had been present there at the Niagara meeting came together again and decided to form an official organization. Formed in 1909, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was the proper termination considered at the time. Founders included W.E.B. Du Bois and various other people that we have talked about. During the war itself, a large number of African Americans joined the military, served in the military, most of them not in combat positions. A lot of them served as manual laborers, cooks, truck drivers, but there were some divisions, some units that saw combat that had African American members. Bear in mind, the military was segregated at this time, so you had all black units. The 92nd and 93rd divisions in particular were all black units. So a lot of these soldiers went to France, and in addition to fighting the Germans, interacted with the French people. What happened was that many of the French people treated these black American soldiers essentially the same way they treated the white American soldiers, as liberators, as allies, as people that they were really glad to see. The black American soldiers interacted with French citizens, and they saw a culture that was very different from what they were used to back home. In France, there was not this really strict racial hierarchy that had developed in the United States. In fact, there had been a tradition in France of African Americans being accepted and involved. If you've ever read The Three Musketeers or The Count of Monte Cristo, they were written by Alexandre Dumas, who was Haitian by birth, free black. So they were treated pretty well, and they got to see a society that functioned without strict racial classifications. So this French society was not like the American society they had left behind, and it showed them then that it was possible to have such a society because it happened in other parts of the world. On the other hand, the white American soldiers, particularly the officers, were a little bit dismayed by this free interaction that blacks were having with French civilians. Here we have a quote from an American general, and he's talking to some French civilians, trying to explain to them how you're supposed to treat black people. Quote, "We must not eat with them, must not shake hands with them, seek to talk to them, or to meet with them outside the requirements of military service. We must not commend too highly these troops, especially in front of white Americans." So the general's saying we can't eat with them, we can't talk to them, we can't shake their hand. If they do a good job, we can't praise them too much. It would hurt the white soldiers' feelings. That's the way it's supposed to be done. And you French people aren't cooperating, you're not acting right, and you're undermining our system. You need to get with the program. But of course, most of the French people did not. Now, this was going to lead to a large number of Black American veterans returning home from World War I with both of this experience of seeing a different type of culture that was not as racialized as theirs, as well as a particular bearing, a particular deportment, a particular dignity that combat veterans just naturally tend to exhibit. And that's going to cause some problems when they get home, as we will see. Meanwhile, back home, you can't see this, the Great Migration, there was a big movement of African Americans out of the South in the 19-teens. Don't confuse this with the Exoduster movement that we discussed before. The Exodusters were African Americans in the South who, during and immediately after Reconstruction, moved west in wagon trains and things like that. This is different. It's a much bigger movement. At the beginning of World War I, 90% of blacks lived in the American South. Over the course of the 19-teens, by 1920, 500,000 of them had left the South. Now, some of them did go west, but they didn't necessarily go to the Great Plains like the Exodusters did. They went all the way to the West Coast, to California, where a lot of factory jobs had opened up because of men going to serve in the military. Generally, though, during the Great Migration, groups of African Americans moved due north from where they were. So you saw a lot of black people from the Carolinas, for example, and Georgia, that wound up going to northeastern cities like Philadelphia. On the other hand, African Americans in Louisiana and Mississippi, the Delta, headed straight north, wound up in places like Detroit and Chicago in large numbers. That legacy is still with us today. If you were to meet an African American from Chicago or Illinois and you started talking with them, don't be surprised if their grandparents live in Mississippi or their great-grandparents. Now, this is a big mass exodus. It's going to result in these northern cities, which had very small black populations, because remember, 90% of the blacks had lived in the South up to now. Those black populations and those black neighborhoods are going to grow exponentially within the course of just a few years. So, how's that going to work out? Well, as we are now going to see, it didn't work out too well. 1919, sometimes referred to as the Red Summer, because of all the bloodshed. A couple of years before that, 1917, you saw a prelude in East St. Louis, Illinois, with a really large race riot. But 1919, when all those soldiers started coming home, that summer, basically, mostly it was in the summer, there were 34 race riots in the United States. And here are the cities: Chicago, Washington, D.C., Elaine, Arkansas, which is not a very big town, but the black farmers there had formed a co-op and a union and were organizing, and so that made them doubly resented, and over 200 people were lynched in this mass orgy of violence in Elaine, Arkansas. Here is a newspaper article: Servicemen beat Negroes in race riot at Capitol. Now, a lot of these riots started with white people attacking black veterans in uniform. That's what happened in Norfolk, Virginia. That's what happened in Bisbee, Arizona. In fact, those were African-American soldiers that were still in the service. The 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, were attacked by white civilians. There were also riots in Longview, Texas, Charleston, South Carolina, Omaha, Nebraska, Knoxville, Tennessee. 1921, there was a really big one in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Tulsa riot was not focused on the poorer minority neighborhoods. It was focused, or at least it began, in the middle-class neighborhoods, the middle-class black neighborhoods of the city. There was a lot of resentment toward African Americans who had succeeded in some way in business and had made an upper class or or middle class rather, upper middle class life for themselves. 1923, Rosewood, Florida, African American town there was attacked and basically wiped out. A lot of people were killed. John Singleton made a movie about that called Rosewood in the late 90s. That's pretty good. In the midst of all this violence, you saw organizing among African Americans, not just the NAACP. There's a new organization that arose, the UNIA, or Universal Negro Improvement Association. It was a black nationalist group that called for not only civil rights for blacks, but for separation for African Americans to be given basically a portion of the United States to live in, led by Marcus Garvey, who was Jamaican. Very, very popular movement around the country. In fact, in Omaha, Nebraska, there was a minister whose last name was Little that was a follower of Marcus Garvey. He had a son named Malcolm that we might wind up talking about later.